folks, welcome back to Carbon Garage. It's been a few months actually since the last video, so my apologies for that. Things have just been absolutely crazy with work, and you know when it's like when you've had a long day, the last thing you want to do is come home and set up cameras and so on. We've actually had a really nice summer in Scotland this year, so we've had actually quite a lot of nice days. Gone quite a few miles in the TVR. Bart's been out a fair bit as well. It's a bit of a shame that it's not been captured on film, but that's the way of it sometimes. But you actually joined me just now, roughly near Loch Lomond. I'm on holiday with the TVR, so it's hopefully going to shape up to be quite a nice holiday. Forecast for the week is generally pretty dry, so yeah, looking forward to what's ahead. But crucially, it gives us a chance to make a few more videos and talk about a few more interesting topics. So the one that I'm going to talk about a little bit today is cost and maintenance of sports cars in general, and how you should think about maintenance costs, and basically what you can look out for as a buyer to try and avoid a car that's just not had the money spent on it that it should have had, but also how you can make sure as a car owner that you aren't going to fall into maintenance hell, essentially, where all of a sudden you're getting absolutely massive bills. Now, of course, there's nothing we can necessarily do, well, I suppose there's some things we can do, but there's nothing we can do to guarantee that we're not going to get big bills. Like, an engine could blow up at any time. The more that you give it frequent oil changes and generally do what you should with it maintenance-wise, the more that you try and do things with it maintenance-wise and keep on top of it, the more likely it is that you're going to have a nice long life, a nice healthy engine. If you're doing things like skipping oil changes, there's a higher chance that things are going to start going horribly wrong for you. But like I say, there's only so much we can really do to try and prevent big bills, and they can happen to any of us at any time if we're just a little bit unlucky. But there are other things that we can do to try and minimise, especially a collection of things all going wrong at the same time. And the key to anything like that, kind of similar to your oil changes and so on, is basically preventative maintenance. Doing whatever you can, as often as you can, to try and keep on top of anything that could be going wrong. And I think this is something that applies to any car. The more premium your car, probably the more applicable it becomes. And in the case of the likes of this TVR, it becomes even more important because I think there's a sense of like a broken window syndrome. And if you've not heard of that before, the concept is that if you've got say an abandoned building in a rundown area of town, as long as the building's being kept in good condition, everything's kind of getting cleaned up, maintenance are keeping on top of anything that could be going wrong with it, the building will generally stay in pretty good nick. But as soon as strange noise there, rolling back ever so slightly, brake pads and discs just vibrating in a very weird way. It's like, what the hell is that noise? What was I saying? Something about running costs. Yeah, so especially in cars like the TVR, I think it becomes even more important to try and keep on top of these maintenance things, because you've got this broken window syndrome, abandoned building. As soon as somebody, vandal or whoever, smashes a window and the building starts to look run down and derelict, it very quickly sort of spirals downhill from there. And this building that might have stood for a really long time, completely unbothered, vandals aren't bothering it, etc., suddenly everything starts to go horribly wrong, because as soon as there's one window broken, people start smashing other things. And I think as far as maintenance goes, there's a similar sort of train of thought. If you try and keep a car in absolutely pristine condition and you keep on top of everything, as soon as an electrical issue crops up, you immediately say, okay, I'm going to fix that just now. You either fix it yourself or you take it to a mechanic and you act on it really, really promptly and just keep everything working. I think that's a really positive way of just making sure these big bills don't happen. It's really common if I'm sitting down looking on eBay or Auto Trader or wherever, looking at TVRs, and you look at some of them and you kind of just get a sense, you get this vibe from them that although they might be relatively low mileage cars and on the surface look kind of tidy, you just get the impression that these are cars that you do not want to buy. And I think it's when you pick up on the little things that just aren't quite right. Maybe a door's dropped a little bit, Maybe there's a little bit of a scuff or a paint scratch somewhere that could easily be touched in, and it's just not been. So I think keeping on top of things is one of the main pieces of advice I would give. The other sort of big one is when it comes to scheduled maintenance and scheduled servicing on a car, there's a lot more to a service than just an oil and filter change. And I think this is something that a lot of people, a lot of owners, and also a lot of garages kind of forget. And you take a car for your £99 service and MOT, they change the filters on it, they change the oil, and that's great, that's kind of the most important thing. But at the same time, there's other things that need to get done as part of a service, and that's down to simple things like lubricating door locks, generally inspecting pretty much everything on the car. And I think as soon as you stop that service regime, which most owners do, especially once they leave the main dealer services, things kind of start to go wrong, but they don't necessarily get picked up on straight away. And it might be you take a car for an MOT and suddenly there's 1,000 things that it's failing on, or it could be that it breaks down, or it could just be that these things kind of linger and linger and linger, and the next thing you know, your car that was absolutely pristine when you bought it, genuinely your pride and joy, is just an absolute wreck. And nobody wants that. Nobody wants their nice car to start going downhill. I think it's really common, and I get the impression this is particularly true in America, but I don't know if that's just because that's where most YouTubers and blogs and stuff come from. But really common for people to ignore things like check engine lights. And even if you know that it's not the most important issue, as soon as that light is on and you've identified that one fault, you're not able to then identify any subsequent faults because the light doesn't come on again. It can only be on once, basically. So when it comes to thinking about maintenance costs, the way that I would think about it is you want to set not a budget per se, it's not a maximum cap, but it's an amount of money that you're prepared to spend with pretty much no questions asked. And I think for me on a car like the TVR, that's probably around £2,000 to £3,000 a year, which is quite a lot of money. And that's not to suggest that the maintenance costs on this car are anything like that, because generally speaking they will not be. But it does mean that if I'm prepared to spend £3,000 a year and all of a sudden I need to buy a new, exhaust system, for example, then when that comes in at £600 or £700 and I've already got £600 or £700 worth of maintenance, servicing costs, etc., it means I'm not scared to spend that money because I've already in my head mentally set it aside and said I'm prepared to spend £3,000 a year on this car. If I don't spend £3,000 a year, well, I could either go on a nice holiday with the money that's left over, or even better, put that into the pot for the next year. And then the next year you've got potentially £6,000 to spend. And if you keep thinking like that, you can spend money on things that you otherwise wouldn't necessarily spend money on. So if your suspension is starting to get a little bit tired but is still working fine, you can spend that money getting new shocks and springs. You could spend getting new bushes and all your wishbones, etc. So I think it's just a really healthy way to think about it. It also, I think, gives a more practical sense to the running costs that can be associated with a sports car. And I think there's a lot of people out there who buy cars because obviously cars depreciate, and cars that were once 40, 50, 60, 70,000 pounds when they were new could be worth less than 10,000 pounds after even just 5 or 10 years. So people buy cars that they once couldn't afford, but the problem is that, as we all know, running costs and parts costs tend not to depreciate. So the suspension on that Mercedes SL, which was £2,000 all round when it was new, is still £2,000 all round today, possibly even slightly more because of things like appreciation. So the problem is a lot of people buy cars and they don't really, not necessarily have the money, but they're not willing to spend the money that you would typically need to spend to keep them working well. A good sign that you're probably not spending the amount of money that a car needs to have spent on it is if faults keep cropping up. And for sure, you could just be super unlucky, you know, like my dad and I had the 924 Turbo. It was basically just fault after fault after fault with that car, and that was probably more because of the length of time that it spent parked up before we bought it rather than anything else. But I don't think any amount of money or preventative maintenance, short of just replacing everything on that car, would have done anything to really change, you know, the number of faults that were appearing on it. But if you've got most other cars, especially newer cars, especially from more premium brands like BMW, Porsche, Audi, etc., you shouldn't really be getting faults on them, especially if the faults that you're getting are ones that aren't typically associated with that model of car. And that's a really good sign that you're just not spending enough time doing preventative things. Most parts on a car have a relatively deterministic service life, and for sure it depends a little bit on the way the car has been driven, the type of miles that it's done. But generally speaking, you know you're going to get maybe roughly 50 to 60,000 miles typically out of a clutch in most typical cars. If that car has spent its entire life driving about London city centre, then you're probably going to get a little bit less. If that car has spent most of its life driving up and down the M6, then you're probably going to get a little bit longer just because there's less wear on those parts. But generally speaking, most parts on a car have a reasonably deterministic lifespan. And with that in mind, you should be considering replacing parts, not because they've explicitly failed, but just because they've reached that point in their life. And you probably wouldn't do that with something like a clutch, because it's relatively obvious when it starts to slip, and you can say, the clutch is slipping now, now's the time to start thinking about replacing it. With something like your shock absorbers, you can't necessarily do that, because although when a shock absorber does get worn out and tired, it's probably fairly obvious that it's worn out and tired. It's only obvious if you've got something which is working properly to compare it to. So if you had a brand new shock absorber in one car and a worn one in another one, or a set of worn ones in another one, you could probably drive them back to back and recognise that, okay, it's time to replace the ones that are worn. But if you've owned the car, especially if you've owned it since new and you've gradually felt the handling deteriorate over time, you probably don't realise that. So you kind of just got to say, hey, the car's done 100,000 miles now. Typically on these cars, suspension only lasts 80,000 miles, so I'm going to repair it, even though there's no sign of oil leaks or anything like that coming from the shocks yet. Now's probably the time to spend that bit of money. And that thinking, combined with the relatively high budget that you set for running your car, works really, really well. It's a really healthy combination, and it means that you're spending money to keep the car working as best as it possibly can. And I think that's a big part of the reason why I love driving the TVR so much, is because I got the chassis work done a few years ago, a huge amount of this car is just a few years old. So things like the shock absorbers have only done probably about 5,000 miles. So although this car's 20 years old now, a huge amount of it is pretty new. And that just makes the car feel like essentially like a new car to drive, or at least how this car would have felt when it was new. And especially on a car like this TVR, by spending this money, you can genuinely make the car better than it was when it was new. Because let's face it, TVR, as with most small-scale manufacturers, every car will have left the production line with a few, let's say, niggles, things that weren't quite perfect on them. And you can spend a relatively low amount of money just to get these things resolved. And like I say, I think that's a big part of the reason why I love this car as much as I do. So I think that's how I would encourage you to think about maintenance in any car, but especially in sports cars, especially in premium cars. Anything where you basically want to try and make sure it's as good as it can be. If you've got a 1999 Toyota Camry that you just use to drive to and from work, you're maybe going to look at that a slightly different way. What you care about in that car is probably reliability more than it is driving experience, so you're probably going to spend your money a little bit differently. But on anything where you're trying to get as much enjoyment out of it as possible, whilst probably also minimising your longer term running costs, that's definitely how I want to encourage you to to think about spending your money on it. Hope you found this video interesting and maybe even a little bit useful. Please leave a comment if this has changed how you're going to spend your money on your car. If you've currently maybe spending a bit reactively when it comes to maintenance, so you're going to be a bit more proactive from now on. Let me know in the comments, that'd be really cool to hear. If you want to see more videos like this, please click like, and to make sure you don't miss out, and make sure you subscribe. Yeah, and a few more videos to come over the next few days, because like I say, I've got a little bit of time off work just now and not much else to do, exploring a lovely part of Scotland. So it's a perfect time to, you know, to get subscribing, because there's lots of interesting videos on the way. Have a good day, guys. Thank you very much.